is it that Parliament is hogging the headlines? Foul language, outbursts, debates over the place and intent of haka? Suspended debates, no shows at debates, competitions for best soundbite of the debate.
This is the let them eat cake budget.
Kiwis, I am holding Maui #1 crude oil. With your blessings, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take the lid off and invite the Green Party to snip it.
There's one thing this government have shown they're very adept at mining, and that is the pits of division.
And ejections. Winston Peters ejected before a scheduled debate about the ejection of Te Pāti Māori MPs.
The issue of Maorification. Would it be Maorification if every Thursday I went down and got myself a suntan?
No, we're not going to do that.
Mr. Peters took a cue from these two, who took umbrage at the use of the words tikanga by government officials.
How do senior bureaucrats not understand that they're working for a government that have spoken very clearly on the Maorification of this country?
Well, where we see it, we call it out.
Are they asleep?
Well, Winston's obviously called it out very strongly, which is important. You've seen it also. We had a situation with Te Reo stop-go signs, for example, recently as well. And where we see it, we actually we say, look, that's not appropriate.
When you think about it, Taihoa seems like a sign of the times, given the anger on display on Budget Day.
Kia ha o tino a wanga e tāna ki te mahi a te kāwanatanga.
Ko kare rātau e kōrero mai kia mātau. Kare rātau e paku whakapā mai kia mātau. E nei, anei tō mātau na hia, tēnā kōrero hia, me kōrero tahi rāta, te karekau.
Women and the lowly paid, whose pay equity claims wiped under urgency, represented half of government savings in the budget. Abuse and care survivors feeling totally ripped off. $200 million towards co-investment in new gas fields. Some new spending for Māori wardens and Māori Women's Welfare League, but as for targeted Māori funding, back into the general pool.
I'm really getting tired of people trying to racially profile us, put us into categories based on our ancestry or whakapapa, and then try and tag the budget funding for that. It's just got to stop.
Why?
Because it's racist.
The biggest sign of all is that the coalition government is on a mission. It's passed more bills under urgency in its first 400 days than any other government since 1987, and the Regulatory Standards Bill is poised to be the latest. Critics describe it as a likely handbrake on governments and councils choosing to prioritise public good, environmental protection or te tiriti. Last Monday, the bill was introduced into the House. A Waitangi Tribunal hearing was held under immense urgency only a couple of days earlier. Thousands registered support for the claim. Professor Jane Kelsey provided expert evidence at the hearing. The scope and reach of the proposed Regulatory Standards Bill could well mean that future legislation and regulations will have to comply with core Act Party principles, and even existing ones may be reviewed against them. So the kōrero is that New Zealand is just a jungle of red tape. So how true is that?
Of course, there are always frustrations that we have when we're trying to do something and we have to fill out multiple forms and so on. That's not actually the purpose of the Regulatory Standards Bill. The goal is to narrow down the scope of the purposes of what governments do to a very limited Act-style set of purposes. And those are basically about individual freedom, about efficiency and markets ruling, and protection of private property rights. And so the purpose of this legislation is to set a kind of straitjacket around decision-making about what governments should do, how governments should regulate in that big sense. And they want it to be Act-style, what we would call libertarian, and let people who have power do what they want to do and get the state out of their way.
Imagine what human beings could do if they were free to do it for themselves without the politics and bureaucracy. And that's why the government that governs best is the government that governs less.
So what's wrong with that?
Well, if we think about many of the examples of when regulation was taken away, we see lots of consequences. Leaky buildings, right? Which we're still dealing with in the schools and a whole pile of other places. Deaths in the forestry sector, mainly Māori deaths from not having proper health safety regulations there. Pike River, similar, not having inspections of mines, etc. Issues in the aged care homes. The finance company collapses because the finance companies could do whatever they liked and lots of people lost their pensions, funds and so on. And so we've seen what light-handed regulation actually means in practical terms. This government is talking in this mega sense about making that the norm.
But is there a middle ground that could be reached?
The problem is that ACT doesn't want a middle ground. ACT wants the end of the spectrum.
This is ACT's fourth attempt to pass a bill knocked back in 2007, 2011 and 2021.
So the only way they're getting it into Parliament this time is through the back door of the coalition agreement, where National agreed to allow this not just to be introduced, but the legislation to be passed.
How come it failed back then?
When they've tried to pass this before, there's been a huge resistance, even from some of their fellow travellers. And so submissions to select committees were overwhelmingly opposed to these, but so were positions taken by the likes of the Treasury. I understand in this regulatory standards bill at present, there are quite a lot of people from the business community who don't support it either.
The majority of the 23,000 submissions on last year's consultation document weren't read by the Ministry of Regulation before proposals on next steps were taken to Cabinet. Of those that were read, it was revealed that only 0.33% supported the bill, less than 0.5%.
The proposed bill would measure any new policy or regulations against a set of core principles. What impact will that have on Te Tiriti and on Māori influence?
Well, no surprise that amongst the principles that ACT has proposed, Te Tiriti does not appear, which means that it's not amongst the main criteria that would have to be considered when bringing a new regulation into play, but also it proposes setting up a board to which those who don't like regulations could complain that those regulations are not consistent with ACT-style principles that are in the ACT. And so Māori are not only invisible in the criteria in those principles, but anything that is done in favour of Māori risks being brought to this board. And of course the board will be appointed by the Minister, who currently is David Seymour, and who can also issue guidelines about what does or doesn't come into the mix.
How do regulatory impact statements tie into all this?
These things called regulatory impact statements and regulatory impact assessments were introduced, which are a ruler that is supposed to be run over all new regulation government introduces. What's very interesting is that the assessments of compliance that have been done with that show that they tend to be not complied with at all in a number of instances, and certainly not complied with fully in a majority.
Right, because there was a regulatory impact statement made around the Treaty Principles Bill, eh?
This is a deep irony of the current ACT position, is that on the one hand, ACT is promoting this best practice regulatory approach, and in everything else it's doing, it's bypassing it. So Treaty Principles Bill, for example, didn't pass the regulatory impact statement test, And Seymour set all sorts of conditions around what they could or could not even look at. He backtracked on a whole lot of things in that process that, by his own standards, should be there. We're even seeing that in the Regulatory Standards Bill. The consultation document had a whole pile of things, what we call redacted or blacked out from there, including under the heading of transparency.
According to the ACT National Coalition Agreement, the two parties agreed to legislate to improve the quality of regulation, ensuring that regulatory decisions are based on principles of good lawmaking and economic efficiency by passing the Regulatory Standards Bill as soon as practicable. During its first reading, Labour, Te Pāti Māori and Green MPs were passionate in their strong opposition.
This bill has failed 3 times already because no one was careless enough to let it through.
National and New Zealand First MPs spoke for less than a minute each. Casey Costello from New Zealand First suggested the bill is open to challenge.
We look forward to the process of the Select Committee and scrutinising the work that will be undertaken on this bill, and therefore New Zealand First support the Regulatory Standards Bill.
Dan Bidwell from National quoted a philosopher who urged legislative caution and then said,
Mr. Speaker, it is with that scepticism that we support this bill in the House, and my message to the public is clear. Submit to the Finance and Select Committee. I look forward to hearing your submissions. I commend this bill to the House.
While the bill passed its first reading, perhaps there are some principles at stake.
We often call this principles-based regulation. So it's setting up a regulatory framework for making regulation. But the regulatory framework is biased, and even that assumes that people will comply with it. And we have a saying in this area of academia that principles-based regulation only works if those implementing it have principles.